We are synchronizing
I see.
Tallinn with Bucharest.
Here.
Yeah. Okay. So I'm asking once again, Victor Izescu to join me, and I think there is nobody better to start today about putting this Lovinescuian project into context of developmental discussions in the interwar period. Victor wrote a lot in different languages. Also, an English monograph is available about how Romanian debates about development were unfolding, and wrote also a lot, which is also partially English available, but also quite a lot of Romanian texts about transition discourses in the 1990s. So in a way, I think he will be able to connect these two transitions to democracy and away from democracy. And we are very happy to have him here. So first, it's your turn. And yes, we discussed the last thing, procedural thing is that we discussed with Sorin that the idea is that we will have the 4 presentations now in a row. So we will not have a debate, and then we will have break. We will have the other 2. And we don't have Fernando Esposito, so we have time for discussion, and we will kind of connect the 6 papers, and hopefully maybe even yet, if somebody remembers yesterday's papers, then we can even include them into the discussion, because I think ultimately we gathered here partially to listen to each other in informal terms as well, so not just to kind of have formal lectures. So hopefully we will have some time to kind of reflect on what we heard. So the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Balázs, for the introduction, and I'm very happy that the conference gave me the occasion to come back to the patron of our conference and to his context, otherwise a topic of long-term concern for me. In 2 lectures hosted by the Romanian Academy and delivered in 1929, The Rationalist and the Historical Conceptions of Culture, respectively 1933, The Influence of Hegel in Romanian Culture, Tudor Vianu, a disciple of Lovinescu in the fields of literary criticism, literary history, and aesthetic theory, but also an emerging authority in the discipline of the philosophy of culture, intertwined with that of the philosophy of history that he was never to claim as an area of expertise for himself, memorably rehearsed for the national audience of the time the tenets and meanings of the entrenched dichotomy stretching through the body of modern cultural development and opposing the conception of Kantian Enlightenment rationalist universalism and that of cultural relativism of the historicist stripe coming from Vico and Herder, together with the Hegelian attempt at a synthesis between them. By the same token, and besides pointing to the new path open for the overcoming of the celebrated dichotomous way of thinking through the activist understanding of culture derived from Nietzsche, he disclosed the ambivalent role played by Hegelianism in Romanian culture as a doctrine able to be appropriated for their own purposes by both the defenders of westernized modernism and those of traditionalist nationalism. Vianu's textbook treatment of the question leaves no doubt that the first view is best epitomized by Lovinescu's theory of synchronism, exposed in his History of Modern Romanian Civilization, and holding that the Romanians are likely to succeed in integrating themselves into the Western-type civilization because all civilizations necessarily interact with each other, being continuously molded by external influences. The argument that imitative modernization is natural and legitimate is split here into several theoretical statements that all lead to the same conclusion. They should be seen as historical laws with universal relevance. The relationship between these laws and the historical narrative of the creation of modern Romania is twofold. On the one hand, they are heuristic instruments. The story of Romania's encounter with Western modernity becomes intelligible, so Lovinescu thinks, only if approached from the standpoint of these sociological generalizations. On the other hand, the record of Romanian history is itself scrutinized in order to compile empirical evidence supporting the same generalizations. The theoretical statements are established through the parallel analysis of and the continuous comparison between 2 series of historical developments. First, the process of Romanian modernization, studied in detail, and second, a kaleidoscopic collection of facts and phenomena picked up quite randomly, one might add, from across the entire span of European and world history. Although Lovinescu never makes an inventory of his laws, we can easily identify 4 such general statements which can be ordered in a somewhat logical sequence and according to their level of generality. The first of them says that nations and civilizations naturally interact with each other, most often the less developed of them imitating the one placed on a higher level on the developmental scale. This fact should not be seen as an evil, Lovinescu thinks, but as the only available means for the improvement of societies. The second historical law says that when it takes place, imitation will proceed from upside down, starting with the institutional forms and not with the social substance. The third statement is related to the opposition between revolutionary and evolutionary change. It says that, far from being inescapably calamitous events, revolutionary episodes are natural occurrences in the history of virtually all societies. Gradual transformations are not always possible, and sometimes a violent break with the past, of which the sudden and enthusiastic imitation of another civilization can be an example, is beneficial. Finally, the last theoretical statement says that ideological transfers from one society to another takes precedence, as a general rule, on economic influences and have to be seen accordingly as the first and most important of the mechanisms by which the synchronization of societies is accomplished. In other words, Westernization is legitimate because there are no such things as unchanging national essences, irreconcilable to each other, which cannot be fused together into a functional synthesis. While it is undeniable that this is Lovinescu's main discourse, one cannot fail to notice that it is inconsistently accompanied by an underlying one, whose normative conclusions pointing to the desirable character of Westernization are identical, but whose basic premises are different. According to this second discourse, the Romanians are likely to adopt Western civilization successfully precisely because they are Western by their inner selves. The latent component of their national identity that Lovinescu, in a confusing manner, very characteristic to the times, often refers to as constituting their racial characteristics, is the defining such building block of Romanianness. Although defined by reference to cultural facts and not to ethnic or racial ones, Latinity is presented thus by Lovinescu much rather as an unchanging essence than as a cultural texture likely to be remolded by historical processes of acculturation. It is precisely their defining latent character that would somehow predetermine Romanians for an unproblematic Westernization, had the reactionary forces not been unfortunately present, such as to hinder the otherwise inescapable process of historical change. Joining the Western civilization, Romanians are actually returning to where they rightly belong, after a long historical period when nefarious and contingent non-Western influences prevented them from developing their latent potentials. The full meaning of Lovinescu's Westernizer modernism can only be disclosed, however, when taking into account its entanglements within the domains of political thinking and economic theorizing. As an exponent of political liberalism, Lovinescu offered a softened version of the oligarchic interpretation of the doctrine in the Romanian context, paradigmatically advanced by his contemporary Ștefan Zeletin, and whose counters have to be disclosed by reference to the 2 varieties of anti-oligarchic liberal advocacy featuring in the same milieu. The one consisting in the rejuvenation of classical liberalism conjoined with a philosophical vindication of individualism by reference to the perception of an ubiquitous collectivist threat thriving within the camps of both the left and the right, and the one represented by the formulation of a socially sensitive liberal vision correlated with the modern departure of social policies and welfare devices. In spite of the differences separating from each other the 3 components of the liberal camp thus described, an emphasis is due upon the assumptions they all shared, revolving around their patriotic dedication compounded by Westernizer zeal premised on rationalist convictions, from which a corresponding rejection of traditionalist nationalism enmeshed in different philosophical preferences is derived. The enterprise of dissociating between the local branches of liberalism has to start from the broad comparative delineation over the long run of history of two intertwining tendencies of Western origins and global extension stretching through the continuum of liberal advocacy, defined by their constantly, although variously manifested leanings towards the left and respectively the right poles of the modern ideological spectrum. Getting incubated in the early modern era and in the medium of the confrontation between the Republican tradition and that of enlightened absolutism, crisscrossing with the tension functioning at the interplay of the radical and the moderate strands of Enlightenment culture, the liberal languages in question then develop multiple idioms in successive settings. From the time of the radical democratic surge nourished by the memory of Jacobinism and pitted against the spirit of circumspection towards revolutionary ventures prevailing in Congress of Vienna, Europe, to the recently rejuvenated debate opposing the promoters of Keynesian policies and those of neoliberalism. It emerges that this twofold classification of liberal stances can only be appropriately employed by reference to pre-communist Romania when acknowledging that the local ideological views and conceptions of development which best fit into the tradition disclosed feature here in the guise of minority discourses pertaining much rather to the domain of opposition politics and lingering in the condition of chronic marginalization, despite intermingling for sure with the mainstream segment of social and political life and taking inroads into the sphere of power. They have to be depicted as such when related to that embodiment of liberalism which enjoyed a dominant status in the national environment. Placed further to the right than the Romanian individualistically based participant to the pedigree of the Hayekian-style liberal wisdom, mostly focused on praising unhindered entrepreneurship and the liberty of trade, this last type of liberalism was always ready and eager to favor the ideals of collective betterment endangered by the combined constraints of geopolitical and structural underdevelopment at the cost of thwarting the requirements of legalism, the demands of popular sovereignty, and the safeguards of free individual pursuits by appealing on a quasi-permanent basis to an insidious mixture of oligarchic rule and economic interventionism. It can be vindicated as a peripheral counterpart with a corresponding focus on bureaucratic interests of the Western narrow-minded sectarian liberal ideology of the upper bourgeoisie, crystallized after basic liberal values had been institutionally and socially entrenched, coming to be adopted quasi-consensually by all parts of the political spectrum. The incongruence between the pleading for free trade principles advanced by this reigning discourse of the time and the blatant realities of a growing monopolist economy increasingly controlled by banking cartels and indebted to state-driven policies of imperialist expansion, contributing heavily to the rise of the left-wing offshoot of classical liberalism by way of reaction. Starting with the last 4 decades of the 19th century, Romanian ideological dynamics was marked by a tendency of leaning towards the right, which would continue uninterrupted up to the years of the Second World War. This evolution was inaugurated by a new departure of liberalism itself, whose democratic commitment, widely manifested over the period of the 1848 revolution, took now on a descending slope, according to a pattern common to most countries in the region. Gaining very rapidly after the establishment of the regime of constitutional monarchy in 1866 the status of a privileged governmental political force, mainstream Romanian liberalism tended to replace lower boyardom with the bureaucratic class as the main field of social recruitment in a context blatantly characterized by the absence of a sizable entrepreneurial bourgeois class. Its discourse was encapsulated in forceful pronouncements of the early interwar period, which made clear that dedication to social discipline was a heavy requirement of national growth. The clearest new addition to ideological refashioning underway came, however, from the part of a new school of economic thinking, set in the tradition of Listian protectionism and emerging in the 1870s in order to establish itself very soon as mainstream within the party and beyond, among both academics and policymakers. characteristically displaying a touch of sociological theorizing when arguing, in anticipation of Alexander Gerschenkron, that state-sponsored social change can accompany industrialization geared by governmental devices. Besides strengthening its discursive consistency, oligarchic liberalism came to be deeply entrenched in social practices, most obviously by establishing, during the long liberal tenure of 1876-1888, institutional networks running from the central governmental offices to the countryside, and able to keep under a tight control the electoral process. Although expressions of radical liberalism did not completely disappear from public space, up to the turn of the century, they brought no innovation, except a semblance of growing confusion and indetermination, and they can best serve for setting in a glaring contrast the mainstream doctrine. Criticisms of liberalism as the main political force were much more conspicuous at the time, and they would continue to unfold into the interwar period, displaying a remarkable unity across ideological dividing lines. They originated from rejuvenated conservative sources in order to develop into the large body of social criticism whose main tenets were shared by the right and the left, and which would come to be described by both its practitioners and their opponents from liberal headquarters under the label of critical culture. Central to it was a critical sociology of the ruling elite, depicted as increasingly dominated by a bureaucratic class with a National Liberal Party political core. Elaborated in the 1870s by conservative authors acutely aware of their new oppositional status by reference to the formerly oppositional liberalism, this idea was gradually broadened into a multi-layered understanding of the Romanian developmental deviation from the Western path of modernizing change. As fashioned in the 1920s by Zeletin, the most sophisticated rationalization of authoritarian liberalism is most striking for the theoretical underpinning it adopted. Reading Marx through the interpretation given by Rudolf Hilferding in his Finance Capital, the Romanian theorists drew from him arguments against the central statements of the local critical sociology with regard to the nature of capitalist modernization, characterizing this one as the replica of a previous stage in the Western economic and social evolution. It was by such means that, accepted the by then generally shared description of Romanian oligarchic system as valid, Zeletin justified its existence as a 19th century re-embodiment on the periphery of Europe of those 17th and 18th century institutional arrangements of monarchical absolutism which had enabled the most advanced states of the continent to pass through the first mercantilist stage in the evolution of capitalism. Under the facade of liberal parliamentarism adopted as an international requirement of civilized public life, Zeletin explained, Romanian society spontaneously developed precisely those political structures and interventionist economic practices that were likely to watch over the growth of an infant commercial capitalism unable to sustain itself through the sheer forces of the market. While relying on Marx in order to argue that the much abused idea of the disjunction between forms and substance in Romania was just the conventional wisdom imposed by a deplorable dilettante sociology, as the modern institutional forms were indeed placed on the firm foundations of an economic capitalist substance belonging to the commercial and mercantilist variety, Zeletin also developed his interpretation of Marxism into the prediction that the fate of international economy was a gradual evolution towards socialism to be accomplished from above under the aegis of monopolistic financial capitalism. Skipping the intermediate stage of free market liberalism together with its liberal political counterpart that Western societies had briefly experienced in the Manchesterian era, Romania would leave behind the authoritarian interventionist practices of the era of commercial capitalism, only to rediscover them in a new guise when embarking on the worldwide path of a renewed authoritarianism in accordance with the requirements of financial capitalism. Placing the final advent of socialism in the distant and hardly foreseeable future, Zeletin allowed for the Romanian oligarchy of bureaucratic origins recently acceded to direct economic power through its control over the cartel of banking institutions obedient to the dominant National Liberal Party, a long era of undisturbed predominance. Radical democratic liberalism of the 1848 era had subscribed to the doctrine of free trade, perceived as a prerequisite for maintaining and consolidating the Western connection, but in fact, playing at the hands of boyar cereal exporting interests. Instead, and however ambiguously, Lovinescu subscribed to the interventionist protectionist economic implications of Zeletinism, much more characteristically embodied over the same years by the writings of the corporatist and semi-fascist ideologist Mihail Manoilescu, himself a staunch champion of technocratic rationalism with an anti-traditionalist cast of mind. Otherwise, when emerging as a separate strain of thought in the early 20th century, classical liberalism along the Romanian path featured as a pathetic defense of free trade, harshly critical of bureaucratism, protectionism, and interventionism, and blaming mainstream liberalism as responsible for them. This ideological stance was later broadened towards embracing an equally staunch philosophical defense of individualism, accompanied by a sustained critique of diffuse collectivist ideas and practices, manifested in the guise of socialism, agrarianism, corporatism, and neo-medievalism. Originally revolving around the short-lived journal Curentul Nou with two series issued in 1905-1906, respectively 1920, this current of thought found a new venue in the journal Libertatea, Economică, Politică, Socială, Culturală, published between 1933 and 1940, this time enlarging its scope in order to reject rising Romanian and European fascism, together with Soviet communism. The voices of Curentul Nou and Libertatea, the most prominent being those of Henric Sanielevici, Ștefan Antim, and George Strat, could be claimed as the Romanian pedigree of the post-war liberal revival in Europe and the whole world, followed then by a new surge leading to the neoliberal supremacy in the format of the Washington Consensus. We could be tempted to see the neoliberalism of Zeletin as a corresponding Romanian contribution to the development of the rival Keynesian view, meant to contain the disruptive effects of market unpredictability by state-induced regulating designs. This is misleading, and the stark difference between the peripheral oligarchic liberalism supported by Zeletin and the liberal search for welfare state solutions started in the West at the turn of the 19th to the 20th centuries emerges clearly when the first one is set in comparison with another representative of Romanian liberal advocacy, the sociologist Dumitru Drăghicescu, a disciple of Durkheim, a professed socialist at the beginning of his career, but also a reformist member of the National Liberal Party, eager to reinfuse it with the forgotten democratic ideals of the 1848 era, and repeatedly pointing to a self-definition as liberal socialist. Drăghicescu's inquiries into institutional schemes and economic practices targeted at the multi-layered redistribution of incomes across the social body, tailored to the Romanian conditions in the changing environment of world capitalism, and best exposed in his journal Dreptatea Socială of 1923, have to be understood as constituting just one specific stance, participating to a widespread local argumentation about the need to make the essential liberal wisdom presiding over the fundamental state framework gradually more sensitive to social concerns. The ambitious liberal socialist project of the respective theorists being predicated upon a welter of other pleadings vindicating the adoption in the context of a score of arrangements increasingly accepted in the West and worldwide after the inauguration of the International Labour Organization in 1919 as requirements of modern social life. This is testimony to the widely changing connections established between the liberal Westernist stance and the dilemma of free enterprise and free trade versus interventionism and closure along the entire process of delayed modernization over the long run of history, in Eastern Europe, as well as throughout the other peripheries of the modern world capitalist system. Thank you very much.
Now we are moving chronologically a little bit backwards with Kalin Kotoy's paper, who is a specialist of late 19th century reconfiguration of the discourse about the social, and in a way kind of social history of intellectuals and intellectual history of the category of social. And he's going to talk about also in a way challenges to the liberal project from this kind of late 19th century narodnik, anarchist and nationalist configurations in a transnational Balkan and Eastern European configuration. So thanks a lot, Kalin. Floor is yours.
Well, in what follows, I want to discuss the importance of specific politics of temporality in the emergence of local Romanian social modernity. And I focus on the role played by apparently marginal agents coming from the Russian Empire in codifying not just a spectrum of political temporalities, but also some kind of left-wing informed ethno-nationalism. This is very much still work in progress, but I build on all the research on the role of social revolutionaries and narodniks in the constitution of local social modernity, but I try to focus now on the effects of two different political temporal dispositions, the one radical revolutionary anarchist versus a more toned-down narodnik evolutionist one, and their adaptations to a liberal nation-building state. I have also beginning to realize that a Ukrainian connection inside the social revolutionary worldwide network might be quite important in how an anti-elitist variant of understanding the people, the narod, popor, developed in Romania through Zamfir Arbore, but also Hajdeu. And even on how the Dacians and Thracians got big historical roles inside the Romanian ethnogenesis and ethnic narrative in this way. But here I'm a little bit speculating still. In the second half of the 19th century, the ways of politicizing time, of articulating possible backwardness, diversions, accelerations, or alternative paths of progress became fundamental in the constitution of local modernity. In a way, everything I'm talking about here starts in 1848, more precisely in the revolutionary exile. The liberal 1480ers systematically warned the conservative boyars that their political economic mistakes could trigger a terrible peasant communism, which would destroy the fragile national structure created or imagined in 1848 and disrupt the historical evolutionary way towards European modernity. But local time and space were still mingled in various ways, not easy to plot on a clear modernizing discourse and trajectory. The Romanian case was seen as ambiguous by these boyars because the peasants were worse off than their Eastern Ottoman brothers, and unlike them, they needed national land. These peasants were not just a labor force, but also historically and prospectively members of the political nation. In this way, they had access to national history. If they were not granted the national rights they were entitled to, proprietary rights, they would become a rural proletariat, worse than the urban one, and would endanger the dual project of creating a nation and a state. In the fracture between the imagined dangerous primitive peasant communism and the distant modern European socialism, Romania with its peasants was somehow outside of time. The revolutionary 1848ers, boyars themselves, promised they could bring it inside the axis of evolution by controlling the temporal social tensions between primitive communism and civilized modern European socialism. Things become a little bit simpler once the Eastern Ottoman dimension was dropped out. Ion Ionescu, the Moldavian agronomist revolutionary, is the last person where this appears prominently. In the 1850s already, the Orient was waning as a consistent social position, as a real variant of the social question. Romanians did not imagine themselves as Ottomans anymore. For Alexandru Golescu, for example, in 1856, the local social question was only a backward variant of the European social question. The peasant problem was the great Romanian problem, which had long been solved in Europe, and, I quote, has nothing in common with the complex ideas and interests that constitute the great social problem of the day among the civilized people of Western Europe. The 48ers' exile ended up developing a discourse of local social temporality in which the social question was situated on a scheme of social evolutionism, from primitive to civilized. The post-revolutionary boyars legitimized themselves as those who were setting Romania on the path of historical development. And in a way, that is exactly what they did. However, the 48ers did not have the intellectual tools to scientifically codify the new temporal tension, the new construction of Romania as lacking modernity, as an empty space, but already on the path of evolution and social progress towards European modernity. These tools or frameworks would come from an unexpected place, from the revolutionary underground of the Russian Empire. Russian anarchists or social revolutionaries who arrived in Iași, Bucharest, or Curtea de Argeș attempted to adapt the social revolution to the Romanian context. For them, at first, the deep divide between the Western and Eastern social orders invoked by the 48ers was not important, because the imminent demise of capitalism would rapidly transform and forcibly unite the centers and peripheries. In early 1877, Zamfir Arbore, or Zemfir Rali, a Ukrainian-Romanian anarchist close to Bakunin that emigrated in the same year back to Romania, still in Switzerland, saw the situation in apocalyptic terms, and I quote, "The storm is near. No one denies it, neither the revolutionaries nor the reactionaries. The head, the reason, is turning against the bourgeoisie. The feeling of an imminent end weighs heavily on everyone's heart. They clearly see the slope down which the world is being pushed by the fatal, terrible question, the social question. The exploiters feel that their world is accelerating unstoppably towards the future. And that in order to reach this future, it will have to pass over the ruins of civilization, over the ruins of their privileges, morals, and institutions." For the 48ers, Romania's problem was that it had to solve the Eastern social question, rural emancipation, but it was on the historical and political trajectory of Western Europe. For the Russian revolutionaries, Western society was different from Eastern society, well, it's true, but in a dialectical matter, the East's lack of historical depths and political and cultural tradition only accelerated the inevitable changes and the rapid arrival of socialism in both the West and the East in the same time. The social revolutionaries and anarchists believed that their lack of historical traditions helped them to quickly adopt what the European speculative spirit had achieved, and above all, the Western social struggle for progress. In their view, the social question in the East accelerated that in the West, radicalizing it. The local Eastern social question was no longer the Ottoman one, but the Russian revolutionary inflected one. Quite late in the 1881, the Nadezhde brothers, Romanian disciples of the exiled Russian social revolutionaries, tried to adapt socialism to a 48er scheme without much success, in which socialism, the future, modernity, had to begin now as a pedagogical act for the future. And I quote, "Revolution is inevitable, especially since the masses around our country are more enlightened than here in this regard. When a revolution breaks out in Europe, it will undoubtedly spread to our country. It is to be feared, however, that a revolution before socialist propaganda has penetrated deeply will be excessively cruel and even perhaps fruitless." This variant of revolutionary political temporality failed to articulate itself with the liberal temporality inaugurated by the 48ers. They needed a period of evolution of national and state construction, even if socialism was the faraway goal. The Russian revolutionaries exiles to Romania had to adapt their anarchist revolutionary politics of temporality with the empty pedagogical socialism of the future envisaged by left-wing liberals. So the anarchist temporality was marginalized, or at least toned down, and most of the exiles and their friends and disciples used a Narodnik evolutionist variant. After 1881, the year when Alexander II was assassinated and Romania became a kingdom, a European kingdom, the revolutionary networks crumbled and were later on rearranged in other political temporal frameworks, including Orthodox Marxism. The revolutionaries that remain in Romania from this global revolutionary network were those who dropped the anarchist revolutionary temporality and started to work from variants of Narodnik political temporality as they attempted to scientifically codify the 1848 project through evolutionary theories, the first scientific theories of synchronicity and backwardness, and the nationalization of the social sphere. These were mostly the Narodniks, Gherea, and Stere. I will go very quickly on. For Gherea, Romania will become socialist when all of Europe is socialist, because Romania was a province of Europe. The difference between society and society, meaning Europe, was central to the attempt to understand the role of socialism in a European national state that was agrarian and peripheral. Local social organisms, says Gherea, were to be united into a larger organic whole, the future socialist Europe. Just as European liberalism had been for the local liberal revolutionaries of 1848, socialism was now for the social revolutionaries of Romania. The only difference was that socialism was not yet as developed as liberalism. Gherea attempted to repair the socialist progressive axis by formulating a social law to explain local anomalies, the so-called law of orbit. This was supposed to explain the movement of peripheral countries whose trajectories were not independent but determined by the life of developed countries. Backward countries moved in leaps and zigzags, and the manifestations of their social life was abnormal or monstrous. Normal society was supposed to be a local historical reflection of Western European historical development. Normality meant the ability to stick to the progressive historical current that was, unfortunately, flowing outside the local sphere of influence. The other one, Stere, partially abandons the Marxist evolutionary time axis in favor of ethnological evolutionism. Using ethnographic observations from his Siberian exile, he presents the Ostiaks, the Khantis, as primitive and degenerate. He speaks of the dizziness that overwhelmed him in the face of the unsurmountable gap between the mystical aurora borealis, the immaculate snow, and the miserable Ostiaks. The dizziness dissipated in a strange way, and I quote, "Fortunately, at that moment, I had in my hand a book that I had been carrying with me for a long time. Reading Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, a few pages on synthetic a priori judgments restored my sense of proportion forever. I felt so small and much closer to the primitiveness around me, which had barely broken the umbilical cord connecting it to the animal world." But for Stere, the main problem was the legitimacy of organized social coercion, the legitimacy of violence and hierarchical control as a means of improving the lives of the half-primitive peasants and of building the nation state. He builds his theories around two, a neo-Kantian jurist, Rudolf von Ehring, and the sociologist Ludwig Gumplowitz. I will cut through a little bit. For Stere, the evolutionary path from primitives to intellectuals to populists like himself, from Kanti and peasants to neo-Kantians and Stere, allowed social organisms, as both Stere and Gherea like to call them, to choose their own path of progress. Individuals could be creative and authentic through the ethno-cultural character of the people, but also and only because they differed sufficiently from this undifferentiated social base, the peasants, the true bearers of the same ethno-cultural character. Gherea and Stere envisage in different ways a way of thinking nation and progress from a Marxist or Narodnik position. But the attempts to adapt socialist revolutionary temporality to liberal nation building branched also in an attempt to transform the inherently socialist revolutionary narod or popor into an ethno-national substrate. The radical acceleration of Western European society and progress into Eastern-induced revolution that Arbore envisaged in 1877 was abandoned in Romania. But I argue that it did not disappear completely. As much as it morphed into an apparently unhistorical, primordialist understanding of the people and its ethnic substrate. Arbore was very important in this transformation in relation with another complicated refugee from the Russian Empire, Hajdeu. While in exile, after his friendship with Bakunin ended in scandal, Arbore became a close friend of the exiled Ukrainian activist and scholar Mikhailo Drahomanov. This figure, who published comprehensive collection of Cossack folklore, believed strongly in the Ukrainians' distinctness and also in a specifically Ukrainian school of socialism. His unwavering Ukrainophilia resulted in his expulsion from the Russian academia. Arbore and Dragomanov started a collaboration with a group of French communards, and in 1876-1877 they published in Le Travailleur and in the larger almanac La Commune texts that were stressing the importance of folklore and the marginal ethnicities and nationalities for social revolution. Dragomanov considered that the national movements of oppressed nationalities from the margins of the Habsburg and Russian Empire were natural allies of the cosmopolitan working classes from Western Europe. More than that, he advised the West European socialists to look at the rural population of their own countries through the revolutionary experience of the social movements from the periphery of empires. In this way, they would see the revolutionary essence of the unassimilated races, the quote, like Provençals, Basques, Bretons, Irish, and so on. Then Dragomanov went on to demonstrate the revolutionary substance and potential of Ukrainian folklore. In 1877, Arbore is still unacquainted with folklore, Romanian or Ukrainian, but puts the peasant as an essentially anarchist figure resisting the state and centralization of all sorts in the center of European modern socialism. In both Dragomanov and Arbore, the focus on peasants, imperial peripheries, and folklore is still articulated with a strong cosmopolitan, internationalist, and federalist perspective on political organization. In Romania, Arbore was at once palatable enough to be naturalized in 1881 and suspicious enough to have his home repeatedly raided by Romanian police and even to be expelled from the country for a short period. Vouched for by Hașdeu, he employed him at the state archives, and developing as a scholar under Hașdean influence, he engaged more thoroughly with the latter from 1891 when he formed Milkovul Society as a nationalist club formerly led by Hașdeu, thus bringing together Bessarabian Ukrainian radicals such as Crăsescu, the former Crasiuc, and Filip Codreanu, and more local Hașdean disciples. In 1914, Arbore wrote the first explicit endorsement of Ukrainian statehood in Romania in a book called Ukraine and Romania that was part of larger political repositioning that involved nationalist historians like Iorga, communists like Cristian Rakovski, the future head of Soviet Ukraine, and also Stere and Gherea. There is a generic conclusion of Romanian historiography that Russian ideology was ultimately unimportant when it came to Hașdeu. Early in the reign of Alexander II, Hașdeu had already realized, and I quote, his childhood dream of kissing Romania's free soil, going as far as to, and I quote again, rid himself of his Moscow baptism. But I think that this conclusion should be nuanced once Hașdeu is re-examined through his more discrete position, namely that of a doyen within the Bessarabian community of radical exiles in the Romanian state. I argue that he is central in the switch from the people as the general underclass, the social substrate, the narod of the narodniks, to the ethnic substrate, the Dacian and Thracians that would define the new ethno-nationalism embraced by the main nationalist poetic and political figures like Eminescu and others. But this needs more research. Hașdeu's prolific activity, his participation in defining the anti-elitist side of Romanian nationalism, also left an enduring mark within the national conservative side of Romanian politics. Nationalism in this vein was probably characteristic for a large portion of the electoral caucus, covering the ground between Rossetti's liberalism and the explicitly illiberal variants illustrated by more or less independent thinkers such as Mihai Eminescu. Besides this Ukrainian connections through Dragomanov, direct Ukrainian connections through Dragomanov and Arbore that adapted the ideas of the ethnic revolutionary potential of the rural masses, ethnic as in folkloric, at the imperial borderlands. Ukraine was instrumental for the exiled and half-assimilated social revolutionaries in order to navigate through and think over the articulations between nation and socialism. In April 1897, Guerra discussed Taras Shevchenko as a hero to the working people of the civilized world. This piece closely adheres to precedents set by the Russian Narodnik Federalist and also by Herzen, in that it fails to even describe Shevchenko's nationalist projects. But the events of 1905 precipitated a more nuanced interpretation. Guerra assures Romanians that Russia will not perish in the revolution, but that it stood poised to fulfill the democratic federalist expectations of liberals and revolutionaries, including, I quote, that good Russian Herzen. Well, and I give you a quote from Guerra, which I think it's interesting. Guerra says, autocracy cannot survive unless it is through new contests. A democratic Russia has the exact opposite agenda. All progressive Russian parties agree on this one point, that it is in Russia's own interest that the various nationalities subject themselves to plebiscites as to what situation they prefer. Some people do not even conceive of parting with a liberal Russia. Most, and foremost among them the Poles, will be placated by administrative autonomy, believes Guerra. Guerra's optimism far surpasses even Herzen in assuming that Poland, already the scene of several national revolts, was not lost for the federalist project. Ukraine qualifies from the same scenario, one seemingly inspired also by Drahomanov. Moreover, Guerra assumes that federalists would also win over the Romanians in Bessarabia, and I quote, with the establishment of a modern Russia, 1.5 million Romanians, including some toughened heroes of the Great Revolution, men who will readily sacrifice and die for the sake of justice, shall henceforth be free. See them already moving about, putting out Romanian newspapers and seeking to revive the most cherished national treasures. Will these 1.5 million Romanians, having now joined the ranks of humanity, not count at all in the struggle for Romanianism? Ukrainophilia also serves as a political legitimation in the post-Narodnik context. To support the notion that Russia was a prison of people, the nationalist left needed to look beyond the plight of Romanians in Bessarabia. Further, the promise of a buffer state between Romania and Russian borders would have found natural sympathizers in the Romanian liberal establishment, and at the very least alleviate suspicions that socialism was instrumented by foreign enemies. A strange, and with this I close, a strange closing of the nationalist anarchist circle can be found in Arbor's good friend and associate Axinte Frunze. In his anarchist and nationalist book from 1916, called Greater Romania, he bets on the Central Powers as the would-be destroyers of Russian imperialism. But within this setting, Frunze makes an interesting remarks about Malo-Russians as having fought Russians and preserved Romanian ethnicity deep in Ukraine. And I quote, the Russians brought over to Russify the Moldavians, not being themselves Russian, but rather Malo-Russians, preserved their ancient contempt towards the Muscovite invaders, and for this reason thought it best to undermine the work they had been called in to perform, and greatly succeeded in this within just one generation, becoming fully Romanianized. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Colin. I think this is very innovative, and many things that you put together is a new perspective on this. And now we are moving to another sphere where this whole debate on synchronism can be studied, and that is art history and aesthetics. And Erwin Kessler, who has been working a lot on Romanian art history and discourses around modernist art, is the next presenter, if he's coming hopefully soon. And it is basically about different political projects in aesthetic sphere, progressive and regressive synchronisms. So I hope technically everything is fine.
Thank you so much. Yeah, the PowerPoint somehow was a bit lost because I thought you will send it to them. Yeah, if you could send the PowerPoint to them, I will reach the moment of the PowerPoint in 10 minutes from now. So it will be still usable. Thank you so much for the introduction. Sorry for the disruption. So my contribution is departing from Lovinescu's theory of synchronism while criticizing it in the way he formulated it in the history of the modern Romanian civilization, especially in the third volume published in 1925. Lovinescu's problematic key concepts of interest here are, besides synchronism itself, the consistency of modernization, the effect of leveling up through synchronization, and the solidarity of the modern civilization it entailed. I quote from Lovinescu, "The law of synchronicity of modern life, which works in a leveling and not a differentiating way," end quote. So the result of the all-over synchronization is the solidarity of the modern civilization, especially of the European Occidental one. Quote, "Interdependence means, according to us, synchronicity, that is, the tendency to standardize all forms of life for modern societies in a solidarity with each other. This process of unification is undoubtedly irreversible, because we can no longer conceive without a social cataclysm the return to the approximate identity of a Europe engulfed by a true civilizing and therefore leveling contagion," end quote. So I will talk later on with the help of the PowerPoint about what Lovinescu said it will never happen. That is the social cataclysm.
Just a second to dissipate this. I just got this
From me
PowerPoint for him
in the
now.
morning.
Yeah. But then now he has to stop the Zoom in order to get you in.
Sorry, I didn't know that. Sorry. Well, if it's possible, we will see the pictures to the illustration. Lovinescu's theory of achieving solidarity with the modern European Occidental civilization by means of imitating its values, practices, and means as synchronous as possible is derived from the imitation theory of sociologist Gabriel Tard. But Lovinescu's theory is a polemical one. On the one hand, it backs the progress through integral and integrative imitation of Western values and practices at any cost, opposing the conservative and traditionalist standpoint, locally represented by Titu Maiorescu, the Junima group, and their more radical followers, which were adamant critics of the mimetic civilization characterized by them as forms without substance. At the same time, Lovinescu challenges his own source of inspiration, Gabriel Tard, who maintained that imitation acts from inside towards the outside, that is, bottom up. Lovinescu insists that, quote, "Imitation acts from outside towards the inside, from the form towards possibly the substance," end quote. That is, in a top-down manner. Quote again, "Imitation acts top-down, that is, from the superior to the inferior level." You already see here what is superior and inferior, the center and the periphery, and all the talk about it. Lovinescu was not interested in the proper modernist substance beneath the formal shape of modernism. Substance is always doubtful to him. He calls it a possibility. That is, not a necessity to have a substance, a modernist substance. Whereas form is a certainty, as for example, in the case of institution. The most important fact is its existence, not the proper acts of its employees, which could be incompetent, corrupt, or simply inefficient. The mere existence of an institution is in itself a pledge for its possibility of fulfilling a task. The absence of that institution is an obvious ignorance of that social, economic, or cultural task. Lovinescu, thus, was a classical modernist in the formalist and conventionalist sense. He is neither a substantialist nor an absolutist. However, he is a dedicated evolutionist and meliorist of the Lamarckian, not Darwinian kind. His cultural Lamarckism is visible in his belief that culture at large, and particularly literature, should be more and more intellectualized to reach higher complexity through sudden mutations in cultural leaps. Intellectualization and complexity are values in themselves, although they are means. To Lovinescu, imitation is short-circuiting evolution. Quote, Without remaking the evolutionary thread, the imitation was abrupt and integral. As we will see further on, the adaptation comes later, end quote. This conception is tailored after Lamarck's evolution theory through leaps and not through the progressive survival of the fittest, like in Darwin. Lovinescu's mindset was truly modernist, and this is why he favored Lamarckism, as Lamarckism favored hectic and dynamic change, whereas Darwinism focused on a more mechanical and much slower adaptation, which was much substantial. Seen as a resource for a philosophy of history, Lamarckism apparently was better suited to modernity, which is hectic itself. But that was only an illusion, a kind of medieval illusion of a consistent world of realities mirroring each other in a meaningful way, as Thomas of Aquinas understood it, quote from Aquinas, causas per effectus, et similia per similia, et contraria per contraria, end quote. Although closer to modernism, this is the paradox, although apparently closer to modernism, Lamarckism was less modern than Darwinism, which proved quintessential for the self-definition of the avant-garde, which is the radical modernism, with its aggressive and polemic cultural Darwinism, which is obvious in futurism, in constructivism, in surrealism. Lovinescu's focus on a restrictive view on modernism, formatted in a similia per similia fashion, that is, modernity should look like modernism in order to be modern, although this is not true, made him blind to the very substantial intake of primitivism of the avant-garde, African and Oceanic masks, to its intake of mysticism, like the theosophy in the case of Kandinsky and Mondrian and many others, and exoticism, Japanese influences of ukiyo-e prints, for example, and why not the major intake of neo-barbarianism. This is my, like in the case of the bellicose futurism, the neo-paganism, like in Dada, or of infantilism, kitsch, and proper mentally troubled creative individuals feeding larger portions of the avant-garde, like naive art, such as in the case of Douanier Rousseau, Marie Laurencin, and many other, say, amateur artists, which infused a lot of power in the avant-garde. Rusticality and even popular tradition as such contributed also to the emergence of modernism, and the avant-garde, like in the case of the reversed glass painting that propelled Kandinsky towards the expressionism of the Blaureiter movement. All these apparently non or even anti-modernist resources of the avant-garde, of the radical modernism, were breaking away from the modernist consistency that Lovinescu was focusing on through his conception of an intellectualized modernist consistency and solidarity of the European advanced society. Modernism was more like a radical modernism, the avant-garde, was more like a Schweizer cheese with many gaps and openings towards alternative ways of world-making, and not at all a Parmigiano-like block of consistent, self-identical mental cheese. For Lovinescu, the best condition for a culture to enter the modernist paradigm would be tabula rasa. Quote, with such a historical formation, the Romanian traditionalism is lacking any foundation. It does not have a tradition fixed in multiple cultural forms, end quote. An empty national culture would perfectly fit the qualifying position for rapidly assimilating modernism from Lovinescu's point of view. This is why his history of the Romanian modern civilization empties as much as possible the previous Romanian civilization itself. Lovinescu shows that the larger the cultural and social gaps, the higher and the easier the leap. He is prone to exaggerate the historical gaps of the Romanian civilization, for example, by not mentioning or downgrading older cultural achievements of such figures like Dimitrie Cantemir, who entered the canon of Western culture early in the 17th century. Quote from, again, from Lovinescu. How could Romanian painting have developed evolutionary from the old Byzantine religious style of painting without the influence of modern Western painting trends? Let us also show the contribution of the Romanian genius in the elaboration of Byzantine pictorial style. For if we have no contribution, we have no national tradition. And then we do not see the need to prefer the lifeless schematism of the Byzantines to the vision and technique of modern painting, end quote. Strikingly, Lovinescu's theory did not cover the rising new generation of artists and thinkers of a neo-traditionalist tendency, like the so-called generation of 1927, which was in ebullition in 1925 when he was publishing his major opus. I named just few of them: Mircea Eliade, Emil Cioran, Petre Țuța, Constantin Noica, Mihail Sebastian, Eugen Ionescu, and their mentor, of course, Nae Ionescu. They were not modern in the strong Lovinescu sense, as they excessively focused on the ethnic, localist, rural, and religious, mythological, and even mystical side of the Romanian civilization, precisely on its non-modern features. On the other hand, through his formalism and the bracketing of the existential experience or substantialist subjectivism, the treatise, the Lebensphilosophie behind all these, say, names, not all, but almost all, Lovinescu was captive in an elitist definition of modernity, but a mediocratic definition of modernity, seen as a more technocratic mastery specific to some cultured professionals able to manipulate creative protocols, standard creative protocols. But at the same time, the triumphant modernist Lovinescu proved to be a merely moderate modernist, although he saw himself as a radical, and he was somehow, in polemics, addressed as a radical. But I'm showing here that he was really moderate. He was not only foreign too, but ignored by the emerging Romanian avant-garde, which made its debut in October-November 1924, when he was publishing the first part of his history of the Romanian modern civilization, through the publication of 75 HP and the famous magazine, and the organization of the first international exhibition of the magazine Contemporanul, which we still don't have the, we don't have the PowerPoint? Ah, okay, so I'm just recounting the illustrations, it's okay if we, okay. It was just, anyway. So the first international exhibition of the magazine Contemporanul brought in Bucharest artists like Hans Arp, like Kutschwitas, and Paul Klee, so major Viking Egeling, major proponents of the European avant-garde. So it was somehow really the radical modernism embodied in an exhibition in Bucharest. And he missed that, Lovinescu. And they missed Lovinescu without feeling sorry for that. But that's significant. So it happened by the end of 1924, but entered a very radical phase in 1925 through the publication of the constructivist magazine Integral. The birth of the local avant-garde happened precisely at the same time with Lovinescu's publication of his major history of the Romanian modern civilization, and it was not at all reflected in Lovinescu's ambitious synthesis. This because the local avant-garde was strongly Darwinian. Its cultural Darwinism, politically leftist, anti-liberal, anti-elitist, and anti-intellectualist, was focused on the proletariat and the revolution. Much of constructivism was draped communism, or veiled communism. It was directed against the neo-traditionalism and against the classical modernism too, viewed both as historically doomed and unfit to the capitalist civilization. Lovinescu's theory of synchronism was not linked to the proper local developments of modernity at the time of his publishing. It is a paradox. He was an apostle of modernism, missing the connection to the vital becoming of the modern culture around him. He missed the progressive synchronism, that is the emergence of the cultural Darwinism of the avant-garde, but also the regressive synchronism, the historical and cultural relevance of the neo-traditionalism trend. Moreover, the contrasting trends were synchronous themselves with the European and international developments. So they followed Lovinescu's scheme. While the avant-garde was synchronous with the politically charged last wave of radicalism after World War I, with the communists baking from various agents of the Comintern, like Eleazar Lizitsky and Rodchenko, the neo-traditionalism of the nationally specific art was synchronized itself with the trend of retour à l'ordre that marked France, the neoclassical phase of Picasso, Braque, Derain, Italy with the movement of Valori Plastici, which radicalized towards traditionalism, the ex-futurists, or Germany with the Neuzeitlichkeit that turned expressionists into realists, serving the authoritarian regime. Lovinescu's theory of synchronism accounted for a moderate modernism, but it couldn't give account of the radical modernism of his time, neither to the progressive nor to the regressive ones. The most problematic side of Lovinescu's theory is the concurring claims of European solidarity through synchronism and its irreversible character. Lovinescu, from the, point of view of philosophy of history, Lovinescu was right in arguing that there is nothing worth to be named Romanian art before modernization reached the country by the end of the 19th century. The process ran alongside the build-up of the nation during the long and very fruitful reign of the first German king of Romania, Carol I of Hohenzollern, who ruled from 1866 to 1914. But that was also a matter of synchronism. I mean, rejecting a national king and connecting or reflecting Occidental monarchy was also a leveling up of monarchies in Europe, as Lovinescu asked for. Prior to that time, local art meant little more than anonymous icon and fresco painters orbiting around churches and monasteries, copying and recopying ancient Byzantine models, like in the illustrations, like, say, Pârvu Mutu and Nicolae Polcovnicu, names that nobody knows today. Romanian art started from the very beginning as modern art. There was no prior local classicism or romanticism. Founded in 1864, the National School of Fine Arts in Bucharest was a typically French-inspired Beaux-Arts school, professing a mid-19th century realism with later touches of Impressionism and Art Nouveau. The two major Romanian artists by the late 19th century, the proper founders of the Romanian painting tradition, were Nicolae Grigorescu and Ion Andreescu. Both were faithful followers of the Barbizon school in France. Constantin Brâncuș studied at the School of Beaux-Arts in Bucharest and then logically went to Paris to further his studies and eventually reach international acclaim. That is solidarity and leveling up. Well, until the crucial moment of World War I, the historical development of Romania baked almost entirely the hypothesis of Lovinescu. One may even claim that Lovinescu's theory of synchronism, published in 1924-1925, was shaped and historically supported only by the pre-war realities. But it was published more than 5 years after the war, when the social and cultural data changed a lot and made his theory less relevant and less plausible. This is why he was ignored. By those who were practicing the proper art of the time. After practically doubling its size by the end of World War I, through the unification of Transylvania and Bessarabia to the existing small Romanian state, Romania doubled its cultural ambitions too. Modernism entered a new era, the radical one. Two conflicting modernist threads emerged in the wake of achieving the Greater Romania. Historically, the first radical modernist thread was the nationally specific art, and ideologically motivated, and when it is ideologically motivated, it is modern, because it's not just craftsmanship, like non-modern art. Ideologically motivated trend reflecting the ongoing debate over the economic and historical destiny of the country, whether it had to focus on preserving the agriculture-focused small production linked to the rural traditional civilization and mindset of the peasant folk culture, or internalizing the rapid industrialization echoed in the urban culture of booming cities such as Bucharest. The paradox of the nationally specific art aptly singled out by Lovinescu, was that it missed the proper artistic local tradition. The tradition of the local art was both late and modernist. They had to invent a tradition out of the local folk archetypes, hypostatized as primitive in a typical modernist recourse to primitivism and exoticism. By inventing and codifying tradition into a style, the national-specific art manifested its modernism, not its traditionalism, although claimed to be a traditionalist. Stylistically, the leaders of this trend, from Francis Cirato, Camille Ressu, and to Ion Teodorescu Sion and Ștefan Dimitrescu, embraced a conservative, Cezannean post-impressionism, raised against the prior Barbizonist impressionist direction of the later epigons of Nicolae Grigorescu, which were generally seen as dated and an artistic paragon of Romanianness. But you see, it's a modernism challenging another modernism to call itself traditionalism. Radicalism residing in their ideological views, in the published statements and manifestos, not in their pantry practice. Opposing the national-specific trend, the first local wave of the avant-garde emerged in Bucharest, as I said before, in late 1924, through the process leading to the opening of the first international exhibition of Contemporan. The political internationalism and aesthetic radicalism, a mix of Cubo-futurism, Dadaism, and constructivism, immediately placed the newly created Romanian avant-garde, Max Hermann, Maxim Marcel Iancu, Hans Matis Stoici, Victor Brauner, Corneliu Mihailescu, and so on, in the larger network of the global avant-garde. A network is synchronism, being in this chain. Yet, locally, their main contention point was the national-specific art, viewed as retarded and conflicting with the cosmopolitan direction of the Romanian society and culture. The local avant-garde viewed itself as the only legitimate modernism, claiming to be the, quote, organ of modernist synthesis. This is the undertitle of the magazine Integral, which is called Revista de Sinteză Modernă, organ al mișcării moderne din țară și străinătate. It's a magazine of modern synthesis. It's an organ of the modern movement in the country and abroad. So it's about modernism once again. So the avant-garde vindicated for itself modernism, and not the kind of the radical modernism, not the kind of moderate modernism of Lovinescu. And they claim that they only able to restore the convergence between the development of the industrial economy and the urban society with the progressive culture of the time. They negated any modernist feature to other modernists incorporated, among others, by the neo-traditionalist currents. By the mid-1930s, the national-specific art and the avant-garde entered both a stage of dissolution and hybridization in the context of the pressure exerted by the rising right-wing politics in the country and in Europe prior to World War II. In 1947, Romania entered the communist camp, late 1947, after 30 December, the abdication of the king. Socialist realism became the only admitted and recommended art paradigm, and another, forcible this time, anti-modernist synchronism was staged and implemented. Its monolithic, anti-progressive, and strictly propagandistic, demodernizing character stamped the Romanian art for almost 20 years, which was cut off from the cultural and social body of Europe. This development contradicted Lovinescu's thesis of the irreversibility of modernization, as well as its corollary, the supposed European solidarity emerging out of modernization. You can be cut off of modernism without taking notice. The socialist realist art, with the role of agitprop, was produced in Romania under Soviet occupation, especially after the exhibition of the Flacăra artistic group at the Dulles Hall in Bucharest from April 11 to April 25th in 1948. At that moment, it introduced works by over 100 artists from Bucharest, to which were added the works of 2 artists from Cluj, 4 from Timișoara, and 3 from Iași, from all over the country, They were synchronous in practicing what they call to be socialist realism, that is a kind of glorifying through compromising with the communist regime. I will, well, 24 years after organizing the first international exhibition of contemporary in Bucharest in November 1924, which marked the debut of the avant-garde in Romania, Max Hermann Maxi organized the first national exhibition in Bucharest, national, not international this time, in Bucharest, which was also aimed to align, that is, synchronize the local artistic world, but this time with the Soviet realist socialist canon. This was an anti-Lovinestian instance of Lovinestianism, of synchronous Lovinestianism, that is, the anti-modernist regressive modernization now is historically entrenched in Romania and contradicting, somehow validating, and at the same time contradicting Lovinescu's theory of synchronism. It's interesting that Maxi was called by Gheorghe Dinu, the avant-gardist Stefan Roll, not a modernist and not a synchronous avant-gardist, but he was called an actualist. And in an interview with Maxi, actualism is a very good word for the compromising avant-garde. As an actualist, Maxi was an adherent of the recent art at all costs. He adhered to Cubo-constructivism in the 1920s and to socialist realism in the 1950s. That was a kind of technocratic view on practicing art. Actualism was apparently a perfect embodiment of Lovinescu's theory of synchronism through imitation, but in fact it was perfectly opposing it. The two directions were strictly contradicting each other aesthetically, historically, and morally. But more relevant is the ideological source that urged Maxi, and he is just an example for several other modernists and avant-gardists who made this volute from Izer to Perahim, to embrace the ideological paradigm of the moment, like any technocrat placed at the service of the power of the time. In this way, the kind of technocracy which was advocated, the modernist technocracy, which I will cut short my presentation because it's already too late. So there was no time for the PowerPoint anyway. So it's the moment when the technocratic take on modernism, which is inherent to Lovinescu's theory, was working against itself. You become a technocrat to dismantle, not to establish or to found something. Okay, thank you so much.
Yes, I think we managed to synchronize with your paper even without the PowerPoint, but now we are moving to even a more transnational context with Lisi Kedus, who is joining us from Tallinn, and she has written a very important book about a crisis of historicism in the interwar period, and now she's kind of, I think, moving from that perspective, but also bringing in the Romanian discussion and putting it into some sort of synoptic reading with the kind of broader European trends of the interwar discussions. And now we will have a kind of new take from the perspective of exactly asynchronism and not synchronism as a kind of starting point. So Lisi, the floor is yours, and we are very happy that you could join at least this kind of spirit.
Thank you, Balázs, and I really thank very much all the organizers for this very generous and delightful invitation. For several really mundane reasons, I was not able to attend in person, and it makes me feel really sorry, especially when I've been listening to all these really fascinating talks. And also, I'm really sorry if I was the reason why you could not show PowerPoint slides. Actually, I don't know which book Balázs was referring to, but I am writing a book about interwar anti-historicisms in transnational, from a transnational or trans-European perspective at the moment, but this one has not been completed yet. And it basically focuses on this second subtle side, as Balázs so aptly characterized it. But in today's talk, I don't want to speak about it in a very general or broad way, but and especially being inspired by the program for the workshop, as I saw it before I decided on the subject of my talk. I understand that this session will be followed by a session on history of Jewish thought, and then I thought, why not to take up a chapter that I wrote a couple of years ago, and that was on Mircea Eliade and Franz Rosenzweig, especially as they are both thinkers that do not need any introduction to this present audience. However, they have not, to my knowledge, been studied together, and I think that it would be telling, that it is telling to do so. So my talk will not be very long, because I know that listening to a Zoom talk is not the same as listening to someone live, but I want to talk about their, if I may call it, anti-historicism, because Eliade is very well and has been called an anti-historian of religions, as we all know, and Rosenzweig as well is one of the best known Western anti-historicists, and I want to pair them not only because of their rather well-known rejections of the so-called Hegelian history that is at the center of their thought for both of them, but also because I think that what really brings them together, I will come back to that slide later, is, their rejection of Hegelian history. It was really not a simple affair or a historic. It couldn't have been a historical critique, because the entire 19th century, as you well know, has been called the century of history in the most encompassing way possible. That and since interwar anti-historicists often talked about this paradigm of history or historicism or a historical way of thinking, they called it as a sort of a circle that needs to be exploded. Then I also wanted to present it in this way to give like really a short picture of what these anti-historicists had to tackle. So it was, first of all, an entire historicist ontology being thought of in terms of causality, linearity, necessity, and process that needed to replace with an alternative temporality. But obviously, historicism had ethical implications, very strong political implications. National histories were devised. Museums, education, even drama was presented in a historical way, and many of these post-World War critics saw strongly related historicism to the Second World War, obviously, where the paradigm of progress was no longer convincing, but instead grotesque. And whereas in the 19th century, we see the historization of most classical disciplines, including law, philosophy, and theology, then also the new emerging disciplines were strongly historical and used historical methods. So it becomes this sort of like, if you had attack Hegelian history, you sort of have to attack everything. Eliade and Rosenzweig, they are interesting because in their critiques, we saw all aspects. They have an ontological critique of historicism. They have a political and ethical critique of the historical paradigm, and very importantly also, they really epistemologically and methodologically begin devising alternatives. And the second reason why I think that they're worth pairing is that their critique of the hegemony of history with a capital letter, then it takes a very strong what they call an outsider or a perspective or a critique from a periphery or from the margins of history. Paradoxically, of course, they then become a sort of very center, very influential in scholarship later on, taking their marginal perspectives to the center of, one could even say, a kind of global intellectual history. So Rosenzweig was supposed to become an assimilated German historian and philosopher. He wrote his doctoral dissertation, supervised symbolically by Meinecke, on Hegel and the state. But then the Great War began, and he volunteered in the German army and served on the Balkan front until the end of the war. When he came back home, he said on the one hand that this Hegel book could not have been written, although he published it after the war, but it was written before. And he also said, who would like to read about these bloody Germans anyways? And in parallel, not in parallel temporarily, because obviously Eliade was younger, but at least since 1927, he has the position that I'm quoting him, we find ourselves once again in the pre-Hegelian position. So he too was a strong critic of Hegelianism and historicism. For both, this Hegelian march of history had become what Eliade would later term the terror of history. The Hegelian concept of historical necessity had been, in their view, at the very least compliant in, I'm quoting Eliade again, all the cruelties, aberrations, and tragedies of history, end of quote. While history may have once embodied a new kind of purely human freedom for major European powers, for secondary peoples, or, quote, nations marked by the fatality of history, it meant continuous terror, suffering, and catastrophes, end of quote, without either hope, consolation, or meaning. And this was something that they both frequently wrote about. So what were their alternative perspectives on temporality then? For Rosenzweig, in contrast to all the peoples of the world, Jews voluntarily render themselves to political infertility and thereby refuse to participate in the Hegelian cycle of triumph and fall of other nations. This became, and then the recovery of his Jewish roots became really central for Rosenzweig's work then after he returned from the war. So Rosenzweig's Jews live, what he says is, at the margins of history, which is first of all sealed by the fact that they don't have a homeland and they don't own land, because it is over territories that wars are fought. This is something that the Jews distance themselves, and instead their community and identity are based on the significance of religion rather than politics. their experience of proximity to God, as well as a sense of electedness. And this communion is secured precisely by detaching themselves from politics, which then for Rosenzweig means from history. The Jewish spirit, he famously declared, quoting him, breaks from the shackles of time. Because it is eternal and aims for the eternal, it disregards the omnipotence of time. Indeed, it walks unperturbed through history, end of quote. So from the perspective of world history or history of other nations, the Jews could be seen to be renouncing life itself, as well as lack of visible communion. Yet it is through the creation and participation of what Rosenzweig calls their own eternity that they ensure their continuance across and beyond time. And noteworthily, Rosenzweig granted this concept of timelessness at least potential universalist implications. He related it to the promise of peace. He claimed that the Jew is the only man who cannot take war seriously and therefore is the only genuine pacifist. Rosenzweig's Jews live in a non-history by means of their religious tradition and its ritual life. Their static temporality is structured year after year by identical cycle of religious holidays, which he called the lived eternity in the spaces of sacred time. For example, in the annual cycle of liturgical time, the Jews experience proximity to God, their community, their shared past, and their awaited future, with all being simultaneously and really present. So historical time is not eliminated entirely, but participating in symbolic time allows one to transcend it. For example, Exodus is not merely commemorated at Passover, Rosenzweig argued, or remembered as a past event in daily prayers, but celebrated each time as a presently occurring event and thereby renewed. These festivities are traces of eternity in the otherwise monotonous flow of quotidian time and flashes of a radically different reality. I mean, everybody who knows Eliade knows that this very much, what Rosenzweig wrote very much resonates what Eliade has written as well later. So he similarly talked about ahistorical cultures and nations. And when giving examples of ahistoricity, he often referred to Romanians. And for Eliade, Romanians were misfits, both in the sense that first, any holistic historical narrative seemed absent from their lives. You know, and here we can refer to this rather common trope of rural nations being ahistorical. And secondly, for Eliade, Romanians had always been subjects to history making by external, more significant powers. For Romanians, it would have been obscene, he argued, in his youth, to endow what had been forced upon them as this continuous terror, as he called it, with to endow this continuous terror as if with some inherent meaning. To adopt the Hegelian hierarchical historical consciousness of the more and less developed peoples would then mean to be erased and engulfed by it, but also to internalize one's inferiority, dislocation, and perhaps even senselessness. So instead, as well known, Eliade became an advocate of heterogeneous temporalities, as he called it. He became very much concerned with the problem of time. It was at the center of his work, but also its non-Western or non-European and pre-modern perceptions, just like Rosenzweig searching for inspiration and making it normative, went back to prehistorical and pre-modern sources and Jewish temporalities. So On the one hand, Eliade was inspired by the combination of static and cyclical temporalities of Romanian rural Orthodox life, but additionally, he spent several years in India, where he became captivated by local multi-layered experiences of temporality. So as several of you know, there is at least this anecdote that as he returned, he began experimenting with radically cutting sleeping hours so as to gain more time for study, as well as with Indian religious practices for manipulating with psychosomatic time. And also in his highly popular fictional work, both from the interwar and actually then war, but also post-war work, his protagonists can shift temporalities from present to past in what he calls enchanted and forbidden locations, from profane to sacred times, to retrieve loved ones lost in the war and depart again with them, or change their age through ordinary yet miraculous interruptions, which then means operating in a very different kind of temporality as the modern linear or continuous one. So while time is a central motive in his novels, it is neither conventionally linear nor continuous, but it is far more ambiguous, like for Rosenzweig, often imaginatively bordering on the fantastic, where ordinary events and time formed all of a sudden a bridge to the transcendent, the supernatural, and the extraordinary. These interruptions are rare, yet they are very real openings to escape what he called the inherent despair that Eliade believed was inscribed into the modern profane historical time, with which Romanians as if should have synchronized, but he did not believe it to be desirable, at least not before World War II. In Eliade's scholarship, sacred symbolic time can be experienced during performing a mythical model, just like for Rosenzweig, the religious model for Rosenzweig. And the communist example for Eliade is that each New Year's Eve marks the recreation and the reordering of the world. It is a promise and a chance for new life, both for individual and the community, while at the same time preserving permanence and a sense of purpose amidst the historical instability and arbitrariness of the Hegelian history. So for both Eliade and Rosenzweig, in the human experience of temporality, as we saw, the ontological and political were interwoven. Yet for both, the hegemony of the modern historical consciousness also needed to be confronted on the epistemological and the methodological level. Is all being and knowledge historical, like the 19th century had claimed? Can we attain knowledge of the human world, most importantly through historical methods, as was also its major assertion? And unsurprisingly, both answered in the negative and embarked on creating a new alternative framework for knowledge. In other words, both believed that the crisis of meaning in the contemporary world was intimately connected to its erroneous hermeneutic orientation, and this meant that their quests for alternative historical methods and epistemology were not only a purely scholarly exercise, obviously, but had unmistakable existential urgency. Rosenzweig did not operate alone. He founded Frankfurt's Jewish Study House that became one of the epicenters of a series of hermeneutic upheavals that rattled the German humanities and the social sciences in the 1920s. The study of Judaism since the 19th century had been very historical, trying to follow eagerly its German sister disciplines. Now this school took up a very antagonistic, holistic enterprise and started emphasizing first of all, the lived Jewish experience, started from one's personal and lived experiences, but also on the other hand, with these earliest past Jewish texts, in a mode of thinking that has been already described in several of the presentations of this workshop as well. So historical contextualization was minimized in favor of close text-centered readings that emphasized the internal coherence, language, metaphorical structures of the sources themselves. And similarly, several of you might know that there was this rather famous new translation of the Hebrew Bible into German by Franz Rosenzweig and Martin Buber that deliberately didn't want to de-dogmatize the language, didn't want to modernize the language of the Bible, but deliberately preserved the text strangeness, avoiding literary modernization to maintain the original text, what they call disruptive, uncanny, strange character. And they sought to allow the biblical text to challenge and expand the modern perception precisely by retaining its alien difference from contemporary mental frameworks. And then obviously, Eliade has been called an anti-historian of religion, and he indeed wrote a few articles criticizing historical methods, while he said that they are necessary for some things, they are only the beginning. And he explained his own phenomenological methodology in contrast to the historical approach. Firstly, he reproached historians for presenting chronicles, I quote him, an antiquarian recording of events or a set of events. Secondly, for Eliade, historical positivism with its alleged scientism and empiricism omitted human intentions and meanings. And thirdly, he believed historical study of religion was too immersed with specific cultural contexts to pay heed to what for Eliade were obvious, what he called transhistorical and prehistorical elements of the sacred. Rosenzweig and Eliade, to sum up, exposed the limitations of the belief that all cultures must eventually synchronize with the developmental logic of Hegelian history. For them, the demand for synchronization amounted not to inclusion, but to erasure, a forced translation of plural temporal experiences into a single homogenized narrative of history and progress. And interestingly, as I said, what they presented as peripheral perspectives did not remain at all peripheral, and their legacies have remained central for 20th and 21st century critiques of hegemonic synchronizing time, even if while very seldom, if at all, considered together. And if there is anything to take away for our contemporary situation, then we know that we in our times as well are in search for a sort of new historicity or new temporalities, with obviously this ideology of progress seeming inadequate and going against our experience, while we also don't want to fall into what Hartog has called presentism. And how relevant these discussions have become today is obvious also, particularly illustrated by the coining and the central position that the Anthropocene has gained in a lot of contemporary debates. And there is a lot of talk about how we need to come up, and we are coming up with completely new temporalities. But what these interwar and thereafter very attempts to rethink temporality and historicity show, in my opinion, is that it can never be exercise of just coming up with a new temporality or devising temporality. It needs foundation, a framing that takes into consideration the ontological challenges that we face, the political and the ethical and the epistemological. So there is no new time without taking the entire circle into account. Thank you. I hope I managed to stop the share. Balázs, I don't hear you at all.
A statement that we synchronized with our time frame very nicely. So we have now a little bit of break. We will have then 2 more papers, and then we will open the discussion, and then hopefully we will have time to reflect on very, very nice papers today. And thanks a lot.
Balázs, I just want to make a small comment to you now, which is that I am not sure that I can consistently attend the next session, and therefore I would propose that I won't be on Zoom, because then people can show slides, and I am the only person today. So I think that rather than I will not be on Zoom, because I'm not sure whether I can stay there all the time.
Okay, but then we will send you our comments in writing or something like that. Thanks a lot, Lizzie.
Well, thank you so much, and have a nice discussion. Bye.
Bye, bye, bye.